In a Colorado whiteout, retired Navy SEAL Ethan Walker saw a snow-covered German Shepherd rise on two trembling hind legs and press his front paws together like a prayer. Only one dog knew that secret signal, and Ranger had been declared dead 3 years earlier. Then headlights appeared through the storm, and Ethan realized his lost K9 had not simply found his way home. He had escaped from someone determined to take him back. Before we begin, tell us the city you're watching from in the comments, and please subscribe to support more powerful stories of loyalty, courage, and second chances. Snow swept across the mountain road outside Estes Park, swallowing the pines, guardrails, and every familiar landmark beneath a restless white curtain. Ethan Walker leaned over the steering wheel of the county plow truck, his broad shoulders rigid beneath a charcoal canvas jacket. At 42, the former Navy SEAL still carried the disciplined build of a man shaped by years of training. Tall, powerfully muscled, with a square jaw, short dark brown hair touched with gray at the temples, and close-cropped stubble over weathered skin. His blue-gray eyes were sharp but tired. To most people in Estes Park, Ethan was dependable, quiet, and reserved. He repaired generators, cleared isolated roads, and helped elderly neighbors without charge. Yet friendship rarely reached beyond his porch. 3 years earlier, an explosion overseas had taken his K9 partner and left Ethan carrying a guilt no medal or official report had loosened. He had left the Navy soon afterward and moved into a cedar cabin above Lake Estes. Beside the mudroom door sat Ranger's dented steel water bowl. Ethan claimed he kept it for loose screws. Not once had he placed one inside it. The plow blade groaned through a drift. Visibility had dropped below 30 feet. Ethan should have turned back, but several elderly residents lived farther up the mountain. Work was easier than memory. Machines asked for fuel and patience. They never asked why he still woke reaching for a dog who was gone. A shape moved near the shoulder. Ethan slowed. At first he thought a branch had lifted in the wind. Then the shape rose higher, narrow and trembling. He stopped the truck and stepped into the storm with a flashlight. Cold struck his face like thrown gravel. 10 yards ahead, a German Shepherd stood upright on two shaking hind legs. The dog was painfully thin, perhaps 8 years old, his powerful frame reduced to sharp ribs. Snow crusted his black and tan coat until he looked carved from ice. One ear stood erect. The other was missing a small crescent from its tip. His brown eyes were clouded by exhaustion, yet held an intelligence Ethan knew instantly. The dog pressed one front paw against the other before his chest. Ethan stopped breathing. Years earlier, beneath a copper sunrise in Iraq, Ethan had bowed his head before a mission. Ranger, then a young military working dog, had watched him. Ethan had taken the dog's front legs and jokingly brought the paws together. You want breakfast, you pray. Ranger learned the ridiculous movement. It never entered a training log. No other handler knew it. Before patrols, Ethan whispered the command and Ranger rose awkwardly while the team laughed. The dog in the snow swayed and pressed his paws together again. Ranger? The name came out broken. One ear twitched. The shepherd dropped to all fours, tried to step forward, and collapsed into the drift. Ethan fell beside him, digging snow away with both hands. Beneath the ice he found the dark muzzle and those impossible brown eyes. Ranger's breath came shallow and fast. His coat smelled of pine and something chemical. They told me you were dead, Ethan whispered. Ranger lifted his head enough to touch Ethan's bare wrist. His cold nose found the old callus beneath Ethan's thumb, the private confirmation they had practiced during smoke drills. Handler found. Safe. Something inside Ethan cracked open. For 3 years he had imagined Ranger's final moments and blamed himself for each one. Now the dog was alive in his arms, terribly light, trembling as though the world had taught him never to rest. Ethan wrapped Ranger in his jacket and carried him toward the truck. Halfway there, the shepherd stiffened. A growl rolled from deep inside his weakened body. Ethan turned. Beyond the snow, a dark SUV sat motionless across the road. Its headlights were off, and no front license plate marked the grille. A broad-shouldered silhouette in a dark cap watched without moving, his face hidden. Ethan climbed into the cab, laid Ranger across the passenger seat, and locked the doors. The emergency veterinary clinic was 12 miles away. He shifted into gear. Behind him, the SUV's headlights came alive. It followed. The SUV stayed 3 car lengths behind as Ethan forced the plow truck down the mountain, its headlights appearing whenever the road straightened. Ranger lay across the passenger seat beneath Ethan's jacket, shivering so violently that his claws tapped the vinyl. Ethan kept one hand on the wheel and the other beneath the dog's muzzle, feeling each thin breath against his skin. By the time Bennett Veterinary Clinic appeared through the whiteout, the SUV had vanished. That should have brought relief. Instead, Ethan felt the certainty of being watched settle deeper. He struck the horn twice. The clinic's side door opened, spilling warm light across the alley. Dr. Claire Bennett stepped into the storm in green scrubs beneath a navy parka. At 39, Claire was tall and slender, with pale freckled skin, chestnut hair twisted into a loose knot, and hazel eyes sharpened by years of making decisions before frightened owners could finish asking questions. Grief had left a quiet seriousness around her mouth after her husband died in a highway accident 2 winters earlier. Since then, she had become fiercely practical whenever a life depended on her. The moment she saw Ranger, she pointed inside. Treatment room. Now. Ethan carried him in. Claire cut away the frozen fabric and began working without wasting motion. Ranger's gums were pale, his pulse dangerously fast, and his body temperature far below normal. He was severely dehydrated. Slow warming, Claire ordered. Warm fluids, oxygen, towels, not hot water. If we warm him too quickly, his blood pressure could collapse. Ethan obeyed, though every instinct demanded speed. As the ice melted from Ranger's coat, the truth emerged. His black saddle was dull and patchy. His ribs showed sharply, and the muscles around his hips had wasted away. His right hind leg dragged stiffly when Claire repositioned him. Then Ethan saw the marks. Narrow circles of bare skin wrapped around Ranger's ankles. A deeper scar crossed beneath his throat. Small punctures dotted the spaces between his toes, too even to be thorns. Ranger had not spent 3 years wandering through forests. Someone had restrained him and injected him where casual inspection would not find the wounds. Rage rose so quickly Ethan stepped back, afraid Ranger would sense it. Claire noticed. "He needs the man he remembers," she said quietly, "not the man who wants revenge." A small figure appeared in the doorway holding a blue blanket covered in yellow stars. Lily Bennett was 11, slight and pale, with untamed brown curls and the same hazel eyes as her mother. Since her father's death, she spoke rarely to strangers and carried a sketchbook because pictures felt safer than words. She studied Ranger but did not approach the table. "He shouldn't wake up somewhere strange," she said. Claire nodded. Lily placed the blanket near Ethan instead of reaching across the frightened dog, then sat against the cabinets, giving him space. Ranger's tense ears eased by a fraction. Claire inserted a catheter and started warm fluids. Ranger flinched when she touched his shoulder, his lips lifting over worn teeth. Ethan moved beside his head. "Eyes," he murmured. Ranger's gaze searched the room but would not settle. The heart monitor sounded an uneven alarm. His pulse climbed, stumbled, then dropped too fast. Claire reached for the oxygen control. "Ethan, keep him with you." The room vanished around him. Ethan saw dust, rotor wash, and a younger Ranger running through gunfire. He whistled 3 notes, low, rising, low, the recall signal they had used when the radios failed. For one terrible second, nothing happened. Then Ranger inhaled sharply and opened his eyes. Ethan removed his glove and held out his bare palm. "Find the hand." Ranger's nose moved weakly across Ethan's fingers until it reached the thick callus beneath his thumb. He touched it once and released a long breath. The heart rhythm steadied. Lily lowered her head over the star blanket, hiding her relief. Claire checked the thermometer. "He is not safe yet," she said, "but he is fighting." The back door opened 20 minutes later, and Marcus Hayes entered carrying a hard evidence case beneath a snow-covered sheriff's jacket. At 44, Marcus had a compact, powerful build, warm brown skin, close-cropped black hair threaded with gray, and a neatly trimmed beard that softened an otherwise severe face. He had served as a Navy SEAL medic beside Ethan before joining the Larimer County Sheriff's Office, where patience and dry humor made people trust him. Yet, one memory had never released him. He had signed the witness line beneath Ranger's death report while Ethan lay burned and sedated. When Marcus saw the dog under the blanket, all humor disappeared. "Tell me I'm not looking at a ghost." Once Ranger's temperature rose enough, Claire took radiographs of the damaged leg. A titanium plate appeared along the right femur, secured by 6 screws. Tiny characters were stamped near its edge. Ethan read them aloud. MWD-R317. Marcus opened his secured tablet and accessed their archived unit records. The serial number matched Ranger's surgery after an old training injury. The plate dimensions matched. The screw placement matched. Even the crescent missing from the left ear appeared in his identification photographs. Marcus sat heavily. The official file says Ranger died at the Iraqi training site. No remains recovered. Status closed 48 hours after the blast. Ethan remembered nurses avoiding his eyes and officers insisting the building had burned too completely for recovery. Then, how did he get here? Marcus searched transport and customs records connected to the date. At last, one entry appeared. 4 days after the explosion, Summit K9 Systems had transported an injured male German Shepherd from northern Iraq to Germany, then to the United States. The animal had no military identification number and was listed only as a stray security dog recovered from a damaged Allied facility. Claire was examining a swollen place beneath Ranger's left shoulder when her fingers stopped. The fur had been clipped recently, and a crooked incision was closed with 2 rough stitches. She passed a standard microchip scanner over it. No identification appeared, but the reader detected a repeating radio pulse. "This is not a normal chip," she said. "It is transmitting." Marcus turned the tablet toward Ethan. On one side was Ranger's military death certificate. On the other was Summit's customs record dated 4 days later. Ethan understood before anyone spoke. Ranger had been alive while Ethan lay unconscious in a military hospital begging strangers for news. Someone had taken him. The blizzard had passed, but the mountains above Estes Park still wore a hard white silence, and the cold made every pine branch glitter like glass. 2 days after Ranger arrived at the clinic, Claire finally agreed to move him. His temperature had stabilized, he could keep down small meals, and the wound beneath his shoulder had been cleaned after the transmitter was removed and sealed as evidence for Marcus. Still, Ranger could walk only with a support sling beneath his abdomen, and each step carried the caution of an animal who had learned that open doors could lead to pain. Ethan drove home by a longer road, checking the mirrors more often than the speedometer. Claire sat beside him with her medical bag, while Lily rode in the back near Ranger's padded crate. The girl did not try to touch him. She simply rested her sketchbook on her knees and hummed whenever the truck hit a rough patch. Ranger watched her through the wire door, his tired brown eyes following the sound. The cedar cabin stood above Lake Estes, its roof heavy with snow and its chimney releasing a thin ribbon of smoke. Ethan had built it after leaving the Navy, choosing thick walls and windows that faced the mountains rather than the road. He told people he valued privacy. In truth, he wanted a house where no one would hear him wake from nightmares. When he opened the door, Ranger refused to enter. The dog planted his paws in the snow and scanned the dark interior. Claire did not pull the sling. "Go first," she told Ethan. "Let him see you enter and return safely." Ethan stepped inside, turned, and crouched. "No work," he said softly. "Just home." Ranger stared at him, then crossed the threshold one careful paw at a time. He inspected the living room, smelled beneath the stairs, and paused at every window. When a log cracked in the fireplace, his body dropped low. Ethan's instincts urged him to give a firm command. Claire caught the movement in his shoulders. "Don't correct fear," she said. "Show him where it ends." Ranger continued toward the back door and stopped beside the dented steel bowl. Dust had gathered beneath its rim, but the inside was clean because Ethan had washed it every Sunday without admitting why. Ranger lowered his muzzle and breathed against the metal. His nose moved along a shallow tooth mark near the edge, left years ago when he had carried the empty bowl through Ethan's base housing after dinner came late. Ethan filled it from the tap. Water struck steel with a familiar ring. Ranger looked at him before drinking. The first lap was cautious. Then his tongue moved faster, and water darkened the fur beneath his mouth. Ethan turned toward the window, pretending to study the frozen lake. His vision blurred. For 3 years, that bowl had been proof of an absence he could not bury. Now it made an ordinary sound beneath the nose of the dog who had returned. Claire stood behind him, close enough to understand and kind enough not to speak. She arranged blankets near the hearth and explained the rules. No sudden reaching over Ranger's head, no waking him by touch, no loud commands unless someone was in danger. Small meals, short walks, and space whenever he chose it. "You remember the dog he was," Claire said. "He remembers what people did after you were gone. Those memories may not agree yet." Ethan looked at the bare rings around Ranger's ankles. "How long?" "There is no honest answer. Trauma is not a clock." Ethan had spent years believing discipline could repair anything if applied hard enough. Yet Ranger had survived people who likely believed the same thing. "What do I do?" "Be predictable. Let him choose, and stop asking him to prove he still loves you." Lily settled on the rug beside the fireplace with her pencils. She drew the cabin and Ranger, though the real dog remained standing because sleep still looked too much like surrender. Ethan went to the mudroom for his gloves and found only one hanging from the peg. He checked the bench and his coat pockets. The missing glove lay beneath Ranger's chin. The shepherd had carried it to the blankets and now rested one paw over it, his eyes half closed. Ethan crouched. "That costs $35. Ranger's tail tapped once. Lily made a small sound, then laughed. The sound surprised her as much as it surprised Claire. She covered her mouth, but another laugh escaped. Claire turned toward the kettle, her eyes shining. Ethan sat on the floor. "You always were a thief." Ranger pulled the glove closer. For a few minutes, the cabin was not a hiding place or a house built around grief. It was simply warm. That evening, light snow began falling. Lily sat at the table while Ethan repaired the torn stitching on Ranger's old black collar. She watched his hands before asking, "Is a promise still real, if the person who made it cannot come back?" Claire became still near the stove. Ethan understood Lily was thinking of her father. He set down the needle. "Before Ranger's last mission, I put my hand on his head and told him, 'We both come home.' I believed it." Lily looked toward the dog resting near the fire. "But you didn't." "I came back without him." Ethan's throat tightened. "For 3 years, I thought that meant I had broken the promise." "Did you?" Ethan remembered waking in a military hospital and begging people who already possessed the truth. "Maybe a promise can be stolen without becoming a lie," he said. Lily lowered her eyes. Claire touched her shoulder, and this time she did not pull away. Ranger suddenly rose and crossed to Ethan. He sniffed the collar, pawed at the floor, and whined. Ethan examined the fabric. Between 2 layers of nylon, his fingers found something rigid. He cut one loose stitch and removed a narrow metal strip wrapped in black tape. One side was blank. On the other, 2 words had been scratched by hand. "Find Rachel." Ethan read them twice. Ranger pressed against his knee, breathing hard as if the message carried a voice he remembered. Someone inside Summit had known Ranger might escape. More than that, someone had believed he would cross mountains, snow, and 3 stolen years to find Ethan. The message hidden inside Ranger's collar remained on the kitchen table until midnight. 2 scratched words catching the firelight whenever Ethan looked toward them. Find Rachel. Marcus arrived before dawn in an unmarked county SUV, parking beneath the pines where the vehicle could not be seen from the mountain road. He entered without turning on the porch light and immediately checked the windows, the locks, and the portable cameras he had positioned around the property. Snow clung to the shoulders of his dark sheriff's jacket, and exhaustion had deepened the lines beneath his eyes. "I found her," he said, "but she refused to speak over the phone." A second figure emerged from the vehicle. Dr. Rachel Sloane was 46, tall and narrow-shouldered, with pale skin, short ash-blonde hair, and gray eyes made severe by sleeplessness. Wire-framed glasses sat slightly crooked on her thin face, one arm repaired with black tape. She wore a long charcoal coat over plain trousers and practical leather boots. Her hands trembled despite the calmness of her voice. Rachel had once been known as a gifted veterinary surgeon, the kind who stayed through the night beside animals others had already given up on. Years of obeying Summit K9 systems had hollowed that confidence into shame. She moved like a woman who had spent too long checking whether someone was behind her. Ranger was lying beside Lily near the fireplace when Rachel entered. His head rose immediately. The softness disappeared from his brown eyes. He did not bark or charge, but his body became rigid, and one low growl vibrated through his chest. Rachel stopped several yards away and slowly removed her gloves. There were small scars across two of her fingers, the pale marks of old bites. "Hello, Ranger?" she whispered. The dog recognized her. Ethan could see it in the way his nose tested her scent and then pulled back. Yet he made no attempt to approach. Rachel had been part of his captivity, even if she had also helped him survive. Recognition was not forgiveness. Claire stood beside the kitchen counter with her arms folded. Lily remained on the rug, her blue star blanket spread across her knees. Ethan positioned himself between Ranger and Rachel without blocking the dog's view. "Tell me why your name was inside his collar." Rachel looked toward Ranger before answering. "Because I hoped he would find you. And because if he did, I knew Summit would come after him." Marcus placed a small recorder on the table. Rachel flinched at the sound of it clicking on. "Everything stays protected," he said. "But we need the truth." Rachel sat across from Ethan, though she seemed ready to run at the slightest noise. Summit K9. Systems, she explained, had begun as a legitimate training company supplying patrol dogs to private security firms. Its owner, Grant Mercer, had transformed it into something darker. Grant was 53, broad and heavy through the shoulders, with iron-gray hair, a carefully shaped beard, and a polished smile that made donors and government officials feel personally respected. He spoke at veterans' events, funded memorials, and appeared in photographs with flags behind him. Beneath that practiced warmth was a man who measured every living creature by usefulness. Grant did not believe dogs possessed loyalty. He believed they possessed limits that pain could expose. Summit contractors operated near military facilities overseas. Whenever explosions, evacuations, or chaotic transfers created confusion, Grant identified exceptional working dogs whose handlers had been killed, injured, or moved before the paperwork was complete. Employees altered medical records. A contact inside the contract system marked the animals as dead or unrecoverable. Within days, those dogs disappeared under civilian transport documents. "They stole Ranger after the explosion," Ethan said. Rachel lowered her eyes. "Yes." The word struck harder than Ethan expected. For 3 years, he had believed fire had taken Ranger. Now he understood that human hands had carried the injured dog away while Ethan lay unconscious in a hospital. Someone had known where Ranger was. Someone had watched Ethan sign the death report and chosen silence. Rachel continued. The dogs were flown to private compounds, stripped of their military identification, and retrained for clients who wanted animals capable of intimidation or attack. Food was withheld to make them more responsive. Sedatives were used during transport. Shock collars and restraint tables punished hesitation. Dogs that refused commands were isolated until fear replaced judgment. Claire's face hardened. The wounds between Ranger's toes? "Injection sites," Rachel said. "They hid them where inspectors would not look." Ranger shifted closer to Ethan's leg. Ethan rested his hand near the dog's shoulder, but did not touch him until Ranger leaned first. "What did he refuse to do?" Ethan asked. Rachel swallowed. "A Summit trainer ordered him to attack an unarmed local man during a private security demonstration. Ranger recognized the man was not a threat. When the trainer forced the command, Ranger turned and bit him instead." Lily looked up from the blanket. "He protected the person?" "Yes," Rachel said. "That is why Grant called him defective." Ethan felt anger burn through him, but beneath it came pride. Ranger had been starved, restrained, and punished, yet some part of him had remained untouched. He had still known the difference between danger and cruelty. Grant ordered Ranger sent to what Summit called behavioral correction. Rachel had treated him afterward. She repaired the damaged leg when an old fracture failed beneath forced training. Grant ordered her to remove the military serial number from the titanium plate before surgery. She did not. Instead, she placed the original plate back inside Ranger's leg and falsified the surgical note. "That number was the only proof of who he was," Rachel said. "I was afraid to expose Summit, but I could not erase him completely." Her confession carried no attempt to excuse herself. She admitted changing records, administering sedatives, and remaining employed long after she understood what Summit was doing. She told herself that staying allowed her to protect some of the dogs. In truth, fear had kept her there as much as compassion. A week earlier, Rachel learned Grant intended to move Ranger and 11 other dogs to a remote buyer before an upcoming audit. She removed Ranger's identification chip, hid the metal message inside his old collar, and opened his transport cage during a fuel stop east of the Continental Divide. She expected him to vanish into the forest. Instead, Ranger lifted his nose, caught a scent carried through the frozen air, and headed toward Estes Park. "He remembered you," Rachel told Ethan. "Your cabin, your clothing, perhaps even the oil and cedar smell from the equipment you once used. I don't know how, but he chose a direction and never changed it." Marcus leaned toward the recorder. "Where are the remaining dogs?" "At Summit's mountain facility west of Red Feather Lakes. 11 cages in the lower kennel wing. 4 German Shepherds, 3 Belgian Malinois, 2 Labradors, and 2 mixed working dogs. Some still have military markings. Others have already been altered." "When are they moving?" Ethan asked. "Before dawn tomorrow. Grant knows someone is reviewing his transport numbers. He plans to send the dogs out in separate trucks and burn the paper files before investigators arrive." Marcus's jaw tightened. Rachel had evidence hidden inside Summit. Copies of shipping logs, veterinary records, and payment lists connecting Grant to the false death reports. She had concealed them beneath the floor of an unused treatment room, but accessing the facility would require a warrant and a coordinated rescue team. 11 traumatized dogs could not simply be released into the snow. A faint metallic sound came from outside. Ranger rose before anyone else reacted. His ears turned toward the western window, then toward the front of the cabin. Finally, he stared at the dark glass above the kitchen sink. 3 separate directions. The lights went out. The refrigerator fell silent. The furnace stopped. Darkness swallowed the room except for the dying orange glow from the fireplace. Ranger stepped in front of Lily, lowered his head, and growled at all 3 windows. Summit had found them. The cabin went black so completely that the dying fire became the only light, painting the walls in weak orange pulses while the wind pressed snow against the windows. Ethan did not ask whether the power failure was accidental. Ranger had already answered. The German Shepherd stood between Lily and the dark kitchen, his thin body rigid, his ears shifting toward 3 separate points outside. One person moved near the western wall, another crossed the porch, and a third remained behind the generator shed. Marcus drew his service pistol but kept it pointed toward the floor. 3, maybe more, he whispered. Ethan opened a cabinet beside the fireplace and removed 2 rescue flares, a red-lensed flashlight, and the remote control for the avalanche warning siren mounted above the lake trail. He kept firearms locked in the workshop, but reaching them would mean crossing open ground. The attackers expected a former SEAL to answer violence with a weapon. Ethan intended to give them something less predictable. "Claire, take Lily and Rachel downstairs," he said. Claire did not argue. She gathered her medical bag while Rachel carried blankets and a battery lantern. Lily hesitated beside Ranger, her small face pale but steady. The dog touched his nose to her hand before Ethan closed the basement door. "Stay behind the furnace wall," he instructed. "Do not come out until Claire hears my voice, or Marcus's." A narrow flashlight beam slid beneath the back door. Someone tested the lock. Ethan raised the avalanche remote and pressed the first switch. A mechanical siren erupted from the slope above the property, its rising howl rolling across the frozen lake and bouncing between the mountains. The man on the porch shifted sharply. Ethan opened the fireplace damper and fired a red rescue flare through the chimney. It burst above the cabin, flooding the snow-covered yard with crimson light. 3 dark figures appeared at once. Each wore winter clothing and a face covering. One crouched near the generator with a rifle. Another stood beside the porch steps. The third moved along the western wall toward the workshop. "Sheriff's office!" Marcus shouted through the front door. "Drop your weapons and show your hands." The man near the porch fired at the cabin light, apparently unaware the power had already been cut. The bullet struck the wooden siding. Ranger flinched but held his position. Ethan triggered 2 emergency strobes mounted near the workshop. Blue-white flashes tore the darkness into broken pieces, destroying the attacker's night vision and making distance difficult to judge. The kitchen window shattered. A gloved arm reached through the broken glass to clear the frame. Ranger moved before Ethan could cross the room. He lunged, caught the attacker's forearm, and pulled hard enough to drag the man against the wall. The intruder screamed and dropped a compact pistol into the snow. For one terrible heartbeat, Ethan saw what Grant had wanted everyone to believe: a damaged dog acting beyond control. Then Ethan gave the command. "Release." Ranger opened his jaws immediately and stepped backward. He did not shake the man or attempt a second bite. He looked at Ethan and waited. Marcus moved through the kitchen, ordered the wounded attacker to the ground, and secured his wrists through the broken window. "Not unstable," Marcus said, breathing hard. "Not even close." Outside, the man near the generator fired twice toward the strobes and moved for the side trail. Ethan sounded the avalanche siren again. The attacker turned toward the noise and stepped into a drainage ditch hidden beneath loose snow. He fell chest deep, losing his rifle. Marcus came through the mudroom, crossed behind the snowplow blade parked beside the cabin, and reached the ditch before the man could climb free. A brief struggle ended with Marcus pressing him face down into the snow and fastening handcuffs around his wrists. The third attacker kicked open the workshop door. Tools crashed from the wall. Ethan heard the connecting latch rattle between the workshop and mudroom. He switched off the strobes. Darkness swallowed the room. The attacker froze, his eyes adjusted to the flashes and suddenly useless. Ethan knew every bench, shelf, and hanging chain. He crossed behind the tool cabinet and pulled the release cord on a suspended tire rack. 4 heavy tires dropped between them. The attacker fired blindly, the bullet tearing through Ethan's jacket sleeve without touching his skin. Ethan drove his shoulder into the man's chest, but the attacker twisted free and ran through the open workshop door. A snowmobile engine started below the slope. Ranger reached the threshold and looked back at Ethan. His muscles trembled with readiness. Years earlier, Ethan would have pointed toward the escaping man without hesitation. Ranger had been trained to pursue, hold, and return. The mission would have come first because that was what both of them understood. Now Ethan saw the stiff hind leg, the bare scars around Ranger's ankles, and the exhaustion hidden beneath determination. Summit had used duty as another chain. Ethan would not do the same. The snowmobile's red light vanished between the pines. Ranger waited for the command. Ethan lowered his hand. "Stay with me." Ranger remained at the doorway, watching the trail but refusing the chase. Ethan knelt beside him and rested his forehead against the torn ear. For the first time, choosing the dog over the mission did not feel like failure. County deputies and a mountain rescue vehicle arrived 20 minutes later, alerted by the flare and Marcus's emergency signal. The two captured attackers were moved to the heated vehicle while Claire examined the wound on the first man's arm. She treated him with the same controlled care she had given Ranger, despite knowing he had come to harm them. The man from the ditch was younger than Ethan expected, perhaps 30, with a narrow face, pale eyes, and an expression that shifted between anger and fear. He had the manner of someone accustomed to following stronger men and calling obedience loyalty. Marcus began questioning him while the rescuers prepared to move Claire, Lily, and Rachel to a protected county building. Snow had accumulated heavily on the roof of the generator shed. As Lily crossed the yard beside Claire, a deep wooden crack sounded above them. Ethan turned in time to see the overloaded roof slide sideways. Claire grabbed Lily's sleeve, but the girl's boot caught beneath the edge of a buried cable. Her hand slipped free. Snow, plywood, and corrugated metal crashed down between them. Claire screamed her daughter's name and rushed forward, but Ethan caught her around the waist before she stepped onto the unstable debris. "If the roof shifts, it will bury both of you. She is under there." Claire struck his arm once, not in anger, but terror. "Then we get her out without bringing the rest down." Ranger lowered his muzzle to the snow. He moved along the collapsed wall, stopped near the generator frame, and began digging. His injured hind leg slipped beneath him. He rose and dug again. Ethan dropped beside him. Beneath the scrape of Ranger's claws, he heard 3 faint knocks. A pause followed, then 3 more. "Lily!" Claire pressed her face near a narrow opening. A muffled voice answered from beneath the wreckage. "I'm here." Marcus ordered the rescuers to brace the roof panels with recovery struts while Ethan cut into the drift from the side. Ranger squeezed through the opening before anyone could stop him. "Ranger, back!" Ethan called, but the dog disappeared beneath the broken roof. Seconds later, Lily's trembling voice came from inside. "He found me!" Ethan dug faster. Claire lay beside the opening and spoke continuously, telling Lily about hot chocolate, the warm fireplace, and the ridiculous drawing of Ranger wearing Ethan's gloves over his ears. After several agonizing minutes, Ethan reached the space beside the generator. Lily was curled beneath a broken plywood panel, bruised and frightened, but conscious. Ranger lay pressed along her back, shielding her from falling snow and sharing what warmth remained in his thin body. Ethan widened the opening and lifted Lily out. Claire wrapped her daughter inside her coat, crying openly as she pressed her face into the girl's curls. Ethan crawled back for Ranger. The shepherd's legs failed when he reached open ground, so Ethan carried him inside. Near the fire, Claire found no broken bones in Lily, only bruises and mild cold exposure. Ranger's injured leg was strained but not fractured. He lowered himself beside the couch, placed his head across Lily's feet, and fell asleep. This time, he did not jerk at every sound or keep one ear raised. His breathing deepened until a quiet snore escaped his muzzle. Lily looked down at him beneath 2 blankets. "He sounds like an old engine." Ethan managed a tired smile. "A classified engine." In the kitchen, Marcus questioned the younger prisoner again. The man finally admitted Grant planned to move all 11 dogs from Summit's mountain compound at 5 in the morning. The paper records would be burned before sunrise. Marcus sent Rachel's statement, the transmitter, the customs records, and the attacker's weapons to a state judge through an emergency channel. At 2:07 a.m., his phone sounded. He read the message twice before looking at Ethan. "The warrant is signed. Full search authority. Animal seizure. Grant Mercer can be detained." Ethan looked at the clock. They had less than 3 hours. Ranger had returned to the man summit, tried to break. Now, Ethan would have to take him back to the place that had broken him and bring 11 more dogs home. Before dawn, the Rocky Mountains stood beneath a colorless sky, while wind drove loose snow across the road like smoke from a dying fire. Ethan guided the county snowplow at the front of the rescue convoy, forcing a path through drifts that had buried the northern access road to Summit K9 systems. Behind him came 2 state police vehicles, an animal control van, an ambulance, and Claire's clinic truck loaded with crates, blankets, medical supplies, soft muzzles, and warming pads. Marcus sat beside Ethan with a radio pressed near his mouth, coordinating the officers while watching the mountain through tired eyes. Ranger lay on a padded platform behind the seats, wearing a warm vest and a support harness around his weakened hips. Claire had argued that his strained leg required rest. Ethan had agreed with every word, then watched Ranger panic when anyone attempted to leave him behind. The compromise was strict. Ranger would identify familiar areas and frightened dogs, but he would not chase, attack, or enter unnecessary danger. Lily remained at the county emergency center, bruised but safe, with Ranger's stolen glove beside her like a promise that he would return. As the convoy climbed, an orange glow appeared beyond the ridge. Ethan first mistook it for sunrise. Then, black smoke rolled upward into the pale sky. Rachel leaned forward from the rear seat, her face losing what little color it had. "The records building," she said. "Grant has started burning everything." Ethan pushed the plow harder. Somewhere beyond the trees, 11 dogs began barking at once. Summit's mountain compound sat between 2 chain-link fences beneath an abandoned fire lookout tower. Steel kennel buildings surrounded a central yard scraped bare by machines, while the records building burned near the eastern fence. Firefighters approached from the main gate, drawing the attention of Summit's remaining employees. "Ashes." Rachel directed Ethan and Marcus toward a frozen drainage channel on the northern slope. Beneath a wall of snow stood a rusted maintenance gate once used by a ski rescue facility that had occupied the land decades earlier. A state police entry officer cut away the ice around the hinges. He was a broad, middle-aged man with a shaved head, a calm voice, and the patient movements of someone who had learned that urgency became dangerous when it turned into panic. Rachel unlocked the inner gate with the brass key she had kept hidden for months. Cold, mineral air flowed from the tunnel. Ethan entered behind Marcus, Ranger walking close to his left leg. Claire and 2 animals control technicians followed with folded stretchers and empty crates. The tunnel floor was slick with frozen runoff, and the walls smelled of damp concrete, disinfectant, and old animal waste. Every few steps, Ranger looked back to confirm Ethan was still there. The barking grew louder as they approached the lower kennel wing. It was not the eager sound of animals expecting food. It was layered panic, howling, scraping, metal shaking, and the broken cries of dogs that had learned footsteps often brought pain. Rachel opened a veterinary storage room containing sedatives, restraint collars, and medical equipment purchased under false clinic numbers. Marcus ordered an evidence officer to secure it, but Ethan barely looked inside. Ranger had stopped in the next corridor. A blue steel door stood beneath a flickering light. Scratches covered its lower half, some deep enough to expose bare metal. Ranger's breathing changed. His mouth opened, but no bark came. He backed until his hindquarters pressed against Ethan's legs, then tried to turn away. Rachel lowered her eyes. "The compliance room," she said. They restrained the dogs inside, shocked them, and ordered them to attack padded handlers. If they refused, Grant made the session continue. Ethan felt Ranger trembling through the leash. The dog's pupils were wide, his ears flattened, and a thin thread of saliva hung from his lower lip. Marcus suggested using the parallel corridor, but Ethan understood that simply avoiding the door would leave Ranger believing it still owned him. Yet forcing him through would repeat Summit's cruelty. Ethan removed the leash from the harness and handed it to Marcus. Then he sat on the cold floor, leaving several feet between himself and Ranger. "No work," he said. "No command, unless you choose it." Ranger stared at the door. Ethan slowly brought his hands together before his chest. "Pray." The word belonged to another world, to an Iraqi sunrise, stolen breakfast, and younger men laughing before danger. Ranger's eyes shifted from the blue door to Ethan's hands. His body shook as he rose onto his hind legs. For half a second he balanced there, thin and scarred, then pressed one front paw against the other. Ethan's throat closed. He leaned forward until his forehead touched Ranger's. "This time, we both come home." Ranger returned to all fours. Ethan did not reach for the leash. After a long silence, Ranger stepped toward the blue door on his own. Marcus opened it. The room was empty except for hanging bite sleeves, a floor drain, cables, and a steel restraint table bolted to the concrete. Ranger entered slowly, sniffed the nearest table leg, and froze when a loose ventilation panel struck the wall. Ethan remained behind him without touching. Ranger looked back once, then turned his body away from the table. It was a small movement, but Ethan understood its meaning. Ranger had entered by choice, seen the place clearly, and refused to let it command him again. They crossed through the room into the main kennel corridor. 11 steel cages lined both walls. Inside were 4 German Shepherds, 3 Belgian Malinois, 2 Labradors, and 2 mixed working dogs. Their bodies told different versions of the same story. Shaved patches, worn teeth, underweight frames, damaged paws, and eyes that either watched too intensely or refused to look at anyone. Rachel entered the release code. 11 locks opened with a hard mechanical sound, but Claire stopped the officers from swinging the doors wide. "One dog at a time," she said. "No rushing, no reaching into a cage. Let them see an exit, not another order." The calmest Labrador came first, an elderly yellow male with a faded military tattoo inside one ear. He leaned against Claire's leg as though gentleness had become too rare to waste. A young Malinois spun in tight circles until an animal control technician covered half the cage with a blanket and waited for her breathing to slow. 2 Shepherds required stretchers because their hind legs could not support them. Ranger remained several yards away, lying quietly where the frightened dogs could see him. The 10th dog entered a crate after Marcus placed food near the opening and stepped back. The final cage held a black German Shepherd, perhaps 6 years old, with a narrow face, a torn right ear, and a coat dulled by poor nutrition. He pressed himself against the rear wall and snapped whenever Claire approached. Fear, not aggression, controlled every movement. No one could safely reach him. Ranger stood, limped toward the cage, and lay down outside it with his back turned. He did not stare, bark, or demand. Minutes passed. The black shepherd's breathing slowed. He crawled forward until his nose touched the bars near Ranger's shoulder. Claire slid a soft lead through the opening without touching his neck. The dog allowed her to guide him into the corridor, where Ranger remained beside him until the final crate door closed. 11, Marcus said. Claire counted again. All of them were alive. A continuous alarm suddenly sounded throughout the compound. Steel shutters began dropping over the outer windows. Red warning lights flashed along the corridor. Officers shouted from the upper yard. Rachel moved toward the control panel, but the side door opened and 2 summit guards seized her before Marcus could cross the distance. One released a smoke canister and dragged Rachel through a stairwell leading toward the old lookout tower. By the time Ethan reached the yard, Grant Mercer stood 4 stories above them on the exposed platform. His camel-colored coat moved in the wind, and body armor thickened his already broad frame. One arm locked around Rachel's neck. A pistol rested beneath her jaw. Even from below, his carefully trimmed iron-gray beard and composed expression made him look more like a respected businessman than the architect of the suffering behind Ethan. Grant activated the tower loudspeaker. "Bring me the dog," he called. "No officers." No tricks. Ranger comes up and Dr. Sloan walks down. Ranger stood beside Ethan, coughing lightly from the smoke but watching the tower without fear. Marcus pulled Ethan behind a concrete barrier. "He cannot move the dogs now," Ethan said. "Why does he still want Ranger?" Rachel struggled in Grant's grip and shouted one answer before he tightened his arm. "The plate." Ethan understood. The serial number inside Ranger's leg connected Summit's customs documents to the military dog declared dead after the Iraqi explosion. Grant no longer wanted Ranger as an asset. He needed the titanium destroyed, and the living witness attached to it erased. Smoke rolled above the Summit compound as Ethan stepped from behind the concrete barrier, leaving Ranger with Claire while Marcus and the state officers moved unseen through the tower's lower structure. Grant Mercer stood on the exposed platform 4 stories above the yard, one arm locked around Rachel's neck and a pistol pressed beneath her jaw. His camel-colored coat snapped in the mountain wind, and ash settled across his carefully trimmed iron-gray beard. Even cornered, Grant still wore the composed expression that had convinced donors, contractors, and grieving handlers to trust him. He looked less like a criminal than a respected businessman inconvenienced by people who had finally learned the truth. "Bring Ranger to me," he called through the tower speaker. "The government abandoned that dog 3 years ago. I preserved an asset no one else wanted." Ethan continued walking until he stood in the open yard where Grant could see both of his empty hands. "You stole a wounded military dog from his handler." Grant smiled. "Handlers become attached. Governments move on. Dogs are property, Chief Walker. Expensive property, but replaceable." Behind Ethan, Ranger gave one low bark. The sound traveled across the yard. Grant's eyes shifted toward him. "He worked for food before you. He worked for pain after you. Everything obeys when the correct pressure is applied." Ethan looked at Ranger's scarred legs and remembered the blue door, the restraint table, and the trembling body that had still chosen to walk forward. "Ranger refused your commands because he understood something you never will," Ethan said. "Loyalty cannot be created through pain." Grant tightened his hold on Rachel. "Send the dog up, or she falls." Rachel's pale face was strained, but her gray eyes moved briefly toward the tower stairs behind Grant. Ethan recognized the signal. Marcus and the officers were close, but Grant needed to remain focused outward. Ethan took another step. "You don't need Ranger for another contract. You need the titanium plate destroyed." Grant's expression changed by only a fraction, yet it was enough. "That number connects Summit's customs record to the military K-9 declared dead after the explosion. Ranger is not an asset anymore. He is evidence." Rachel's breathing caught. Ethan continued before Grant could answer. "The transmitter is already in evidence. The customs files are copied. Your men were arrested at my cabin. Killing Ranger will not erase what you did." "Paper burns," Grant replied. "Witnesses forget. Scars don't." Ethan pointed toward the kennel building. "Neither do 11 living dogs." The ventilation fans roared to life behind them as firefighters restored the system, clearing smoke from the lower corridors. The sudden mechanical thunder covered the final steps of Marcus's team. Rachel saw movement reflected in the tower window. She drove her heel down onto Grant's boot and dropped her weight. Grant cursed. The pistol fired, shattering the loudspeaker above them. Ethan ran toward the exterior stairs as Marcus and 2 officers burst through the platform door. Rachel rolled behind the metal control cabinet. Grant swung the pistol toward Marcus, but one officer struck his wrist against the railing. The weapon fell into the yard below. Grant charged across the platform and climbed onto the narrow maintenance walkway leading toward the antenna shed. Snow and ash had made the metal slick. Ethan reached the top as Grant turned, his polished composure finally broken. The respected donor and smiling contractor had disappeared. What remained was a frightened man whose power had always depended on cages, paperwork, and victims unable to speak. Grant lunged. Ethan blocked the first blow and drove him backward, careful not to let anger decide the fight. Grant grabbed the front of Ethan's coat and both men struck the rail. Rusted bolts tore loose. Grant slipped over the edge, catching the lower bar with one hand. His body swung above the burning records building. For one breath, Ethan could have done nothing. He thought of Ranger crawling through 40 miles of winter forest. He thought of the scars beneath the dog's throat, the injections between his toes, and 3 stolen years that could never be returned. Grant looked up, no longer smiling. "Help me." Ethan reached down and seized his wrist. Pain pulled through Ethan's shoulder as Marcus grabbed the back of his jacket. Together, they hauled Grant over the railing. The moment his boots touched the platform, officers forced him face down and secured his wrists. Grant stared at Ethan with hatred and confusion. "Why?" Ethan looked toward the yard where Ranger stood beside Claire. "Because dying would be easy. You're going to answer for every cage." Marcus read Grant his rights while Rachel sat against the tower wall, one hand pressed to her bruised throat. She was shaken, but conscious. When Ethan offered his hand, she hesitated before taking it. "The ledger," she said. "He didn't find it." Rachel led Marcus to an unused hydrotherapy room beneath the kennel wing. Under a loose section of rubber flooring, investigators discovered a sealed red case containing transport ledgers, altered veterinary records, payment lists, and copies of death certificates for military working dogs moved through Summit. Ranger's titanium plate connected his military identity to the customs shipment. The removed transmitter tied Summit's security network to the men who followed him. The captured employees described starvation, restraint, sedation, and false training reports. Grant's system, once protected by respectable photographs and government contracts, began collapsing under evidence too physical and too numerous to dismiss. 11 dogs left the compound alive that morning. Some were carried on stretchers, others walked slowly beside rescue workers, and the frightened black German Shepherd followed Ranger into the transport van. Ethan watched until every door was secured. Only then did he kneel beside Ranger. "We both came home," he whispered. Ranger leaned his forehead against Ethan's chest. 3 months later, the final snow had retreated from the meadows around Lake Estes. Grant Mercer and several people who helped alter records were indicted on charges connected to fraud, animal cruelty, illegal transport, and obstruction of justice. Rachel accepted responsibility for the documents she had changed. Her veterinary license remained under review, but investigators acknowledged that she had preserved the titanium serial number, saved the ledger, released Ranger, and helped recover the other dogs. She spent her days assisting federal teams in identifying stolen animals and locating former handlers. Marcus finally requested a correction to the report he had signed 3 years earlier. When Ranger's status changed from deceased to recovered and honorably retired, Marcus printed the document and sat alone in his vehicle for nearly an hour. The guilt did not vanish, but it was no longer a grave he had to visit every day. Claire reopened the rear ward of her clinic as a treatment center for animals with severe trauma. Her patients became the foundation of the program. No forced contact, no unnecessary restraints, and no demand that frightened animals prove they were grateful. Lily painted yellow stars above the recovery kennels. She still missed her father, but she could now speak about his laugh, his terrible singing, and the winter mornings when he burned pancakes without lowering her voice as though memory might break. Ranger spent much of his time beside her. His black and tan coat had regained its shine, weight had returned across his shoulders, and the injured hind leg grew stronger with careful exercise. The scars remained. So did the torn ear. Ethan no longer wished them away. They were not signs that Ranger had been ruined. They were proof that he had survived without surrendering the part of himself that knew kindness from cruelty. Ethan converted the land beside his cabin into Second Promise Sanctuary, a rehabilitation center where traumatized working dogs could recover alongside veterans struggling to return to ordinary life. The Black Shepherd from Summit became the sanctuary's first permanent resident. Other dogs arrived quietly, often with handlers who believed they had failed each other. Ethan never promised easy healing. He only promised that no one would be forced through a door before they were ready. At the opening ceremony, Ranger stood beside Ethan beneath a clear Colorado sky. Claire, Lily, Marcus, and Rachel watched from the small crowd. Ethan brought his hands together. "Pray." Ranger looked at him, one ear upright and the damaged one tilted slightly sideways. Then he noticed Lily holding a piece of cheese near the porch. He turned away from Ethan and trotted toward her. Laughter moved through the crowd. Ethan did not call him back. Ranger no longer needed to prove he was obedient, brave, or useful. He had already given enough. That night, Claire and Lily sat at Ethan's kitchen table while the fire burned low. Ranger slept beside the hearth with Ethan's missing glove beneath one front paw. His breathing was deep and peaceful. Near the mudroom door, the dented steel bowl held fresh water, and small drops marked the floor around it. The bowl was no longer waiting. The promise once buried beneath smoke and false records had finally been fulfilled. They had both come home. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with doors opening in the sky. Sometimes God sends them quietly through tired paws, an old promise, or a faithful heart that refuses to stop searching. Ranger's journey reminds us that what seems lost may only be finding its way home, and that healing often begins when love chooses patience over fear. In daily life, we may carry grief, guilt, or wounds no one can see, but God can still use kindness, forgiveness, and second chances to rebuild what pain has broken. Never believe your darkest season is the end of your story. A small act of compassion may become someone else's miracle. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment about the promise you are holding on to, and subscribe for stories of faith and courage. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide you home.